Just one second. Let me introduce you. I'm sorry. I just needed to turn on the recording feature just to let everybody know. This will be recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel, which you can access from the Gulf Coast Prairie LCC website. Dr. Tim Brush is a professor of biology at the University of Texas, Pan American. Since the fall of 1991, he has been studying avian ecology and conservation in the Lower Rio Grande Valley of Texas. He focused mainly on the status and conservation of declining and limited range bird species of riparian woodlands. Since 1998, he has published more than 24 articles and made 22 conference presentations on birds of the Lower Rio Grande Valley and adjacent areas, and has graduated 5 master's thesis students. Dr. Brush is currently studying the effectiveness of habitat restoration for bird communities along the Lower Rio Grande in a project funded by the Gulf Coast Prairie Landscape Conservation Cooperative. And so I'll turn it over to you. Just as an FYI, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to use the chat box. Everyone is currently on mute, but you can ask questions later by hitting *6 to unmute yourself or typing in the chat box. So I'll turn it over to you now, Tim.
Okay, thanks a lot, Blair, and good afternoon to everyone. Yes, I'd like to talk today about some of the research that I've been doing for the past couple of years here in the Valley. My co-author, Dr. Faria, is currently on maternity leave, and her specialty is climate change. So this presentation is focusing on the habitat use aspects. And if anyone wants to contact me later at any point, you can see my email address down at the bottom of that first screen. So just a little background on avian diversity in the Lower Rio Grande Valley. We're very diverse with over 500 species of birds. About half of the species in North America, north of Mexico, have been reported here. Obviously, a lot are migrants. But we have a subset of species that are mainly tropical in distribution. So some have declined greatly due to habitat loss, deterioration, and also fragmentation. You can see some of the common species there, like Altamira oriole, and the others we'll talk about. So the project need was related to the extensive habitat loss and fragmentation. It's estimated that about 95% of the riparian corridor along the Lower Rio Grande has been removed, and so there have been isolated fragments pretty much surrounded by agricultural land. And you can see in the upper right a typical fragment, and in the lower right is one of the remaining remnant stands. There have been some efforts to combat habitat loss for the last 2 to 3 decades. Fish and Wildlife Service and other agencies have sponsored planting days, Rio Reforestation they're called, to create additional habitat and to connect up the remnant tracts. So the goal of this study was monitoring. So we wanted to compare bird use of existing mature riparian habitats, which you can see in the upper right, with those that have been revegetated, one example of which you can see in the lower right. A lot of the reveg tracts are 15 to 25 years of age approximately. Also, given rapid urbanization in the area, we wanted to do a preliminary exploration of bird use in urban woodlots and mature urban habitats as well. So we'll talk about that briefly as we go along. But just a word about riparian habitat in the valley. We're using the broad sense of the word riparian, so it includes the tall riparian forest and also the shorter thorn forest, because both are really influenced by the river in some way, and the habitats are often mixed together. But due to long-term drought and lack of seasonal flooding, most of the riparian habitat is now thorn forest, which is anywhere from 3 to 5 or 6 meters tall, or even thorn scrub, which is generally 1 to 2 meters height, with a lot of mesquite, but a broad diversity of other thorny plants. So the study area is in the Lower Rio Grande Valley, the 4-county area for the Gulf of Mexico on the right, and Falcon Dam in the upper left. So we established study points in the boxed area, which contains most of the remaining thorn forests and associated habitats in the LRGV. Santa Ana Refuge is right about in the middle, to give you a point of reference, and there's many tracts of the Lower Rio Grande Valley National Wildlife Refuge as well as some state land and private lands. The gray is the urbanized areas. You can see they approach some of the tracts pretty closely. So here's an overview of our census points. We established 106 census plots. 92 were in mature and re-veg, and these are shown in the yellow scattered along the river. We just put a small number, 14, in urban mature or urban woodlot and residential, just to do some preliminary work. And we placed our points in the re-veg habitats as close as possible to mature areas to control for environmental factors. So they'd at least be potentially similar habitat, and all of them were within 10 kilometers of mature habitat. So here's some other examples of mature and re-veg. On the left is me in the mature thorn forest with a closed canopy, well-developed leaf litter, pretty dense. And then re-veg habitats, this is kind of an extremely successful one, which approached mature habitat in structure. Others were open to varying degrees. So we obtained foliage profile data using the pole method, the number of hits on the pole at different heights. So the lighter blue is the mature habitat. You can see most of the vegetation is between 1 and 4 meters in height. And then the mature, the re-veg is the darker blue. You can see a large amount at 0 to 1 meter and a lot of variability there too, and then differing amounts as you go up. The same general height, but different distribution of vegetation between mature and re-veg. For the urban habitats, we chose the ones that were as well developed as possible with dense foliage and mature trees. So we had some urban woodlots, which were small wooded parks. They often were quite similar to mature thorn forests, but had some open areas. And we also chose some older, diverse residential neighborhoods. Oftentimes they had trees that were suitable for cavities, like this golden-fronted woodpecker at a nest cavity. We followed standard point count methodology. So we conducted a total of 4 10-minute bird counts during May and June of 2013 and 2014 in the early morning. Recorded birds in the various distance bands, but for this paper we're only using birds detected within 100 meters to allow closer habitat associations. And that's my son and one of my field biologists, John, in the lower right. So just the basic results, we looked a lot at frequency rather than density. So it's the number of times a species was recorded in a habitat out of the total number of surveys. So for example, one of our most widespread species, the olive sparrow, occurred on 88.3% of mature surveys, but only 46.4% of, I should say, urban woodlot surveys. And we found some different patterns of habitat use. So first of all, some species which were formerly characteristic of tall riparian forests and thorn forests were not detected on our points, like the red-billed pigeon, which is a GCP LCC focal species. This was formerly common in the area, but now it's a rare breeder, and we only observed one flyover on one occasion at Santa Ana. Rose-throated Bicard also no longer breeds here regularly. Tropical Parula was once a very common habitat specialist in the tall forest with abundant Spanish moss, but now it's a rare migrant or winter visitor. And then Audubon's oriole has been affected by cowbirds, so now it tends to be in the less fragmented areas outside of our immediate study area. So these species were not recorded. Of the species that were recorded, there were some, like olive sparrow, that made very little distinction between mature and re-veg habitats. So you can see the blue is the olive sparrow, almost 90% frequency in both mature and re-veg, and then about 50% in urban woodlots, and then none in the mature urban neighborhoods. So basically they're almost everywhere along the river, and they're even using some of the urban woodlots. Some species preferred mature habitats over revegetated. So let me walk you through the white-winged dove, which you can see was above 70% in mature, only about 45% of the census is in re-veg, But then it did make heavy use of urban woodlots and mature urban areas as well. Likewise, long-billed thrasher and white-tipped dove were more common in mature than in re-veg. And again, they made some extensive use of urban woodlots as well. Other birds made greater use, at least to some degree, of the revegetated habitats. So for example, let's take northern mockingbird. It was about just under 60% frequency in mature, but up to about 80% in re-veg. And then again, as we all know, mockingbirds occur regularly in urban areas as well. But mockingbird, mourning dove, and yellow-billed cuckoo were all using these re-veg areas quite extensively, as well as some other species that are not shown here. And there were other species that seemed to prefer, or at least made greater use of urban areas, like for example, the great kiskadee, one of our local birds, subtropical, tropical birds. They did occur in mature and re-veg, but at fairly low percentages. We were somewhat surprised that they occurred more regularly in urban woodlots than urban mature, perhaps because of the richer food resources, especially during the drought that the area happened to be undergoing at that time. And then we had some uncommon tropical species. Notice on this scale that it's a different scale, so it only goes up to 9% frequency. So these are all low frequencies, but we were encouraged that northern beardless triannulates, Altamira orioles, and greyhawks were using the re-veg to a fair degree, and two of those species also used urban woodlots. We had thought they might be more restricted to the mature sites, but they were at least showing some signs of spreading and using these other habitats. So at the community level, the mature and revegetated habitats were quite similar. These are top 10 lists. So these are the top 10 species in mature. And without going into any great detail, it's basically the same 10 species, but in different orders. So for example, golden-fronted was more frequent in mature than it was in re-veg, whereas northern mockingbird was more frequent in re-veg than it was in mature. But the only species where it varied in the top 10 were white-tipped dove and ladderback woodpecker. So I guess the point is that the birds are using these areas almost as if they're approaching mature habitat, at least in terms of the most common species that are present. So that was encouraging. We also did principal components analysis, which I don't have time to go into the details of, but this basically reveals gradients, and it allows you to group birds that respond similarly to particular habitat features. So just to walk you through it, one of our results was mature thorn forest points with high litter quality, lots of leaf litter, high canopy cover, abundant Texas ebony foliage, which is one of our dominant trees here, and strong foliage density at 1 to 4 meters. Most of those points were at mature habitats, as you would expect, and the birds that selected that variable as the most important, including white-winged dove, white-tipped dove, which is another species of a priority species for the Gulf Coast Prairie LCC, chachalaca, long-billed thrasher, and Altamira oriole. So those are using more the mature habitats. But then we had species like golden-fronted woodpecker and yellow-billed cuckoo in the second group that use semi-open woodlands, which could either be in mature or re-veg, and these had high tree species diversity and some fruiting species. We also had tall mesic riparian forests. These are remnants of the much more extensive forests that formerly occurred over larger areas. So the foliage was higher. There were abundant cedar elms and other tall trees, and they were often adjacent to wetlands. Most of these were in mature tracts, but we did have a couple re-veg sites where the trees had grown quite quickly, probably due to their proximity to water. So species like Carolina wren, common yellowthroat, and lesser goldfinch were associated with that habitat. And I just want to point out we do have some endemic subspecies of Carolina wren and Brownsville yellowthroat that we want to look at a little bit further. There was also dense low thorn forest. These were found in both mature and re-veg. So more open country birds, scrub birds like verdin and common ground dove fell out in that area. We also did partial least squares regression to reveal which one feature was the most important, at least from frequency data. And so without going into tremendous detail, you can see there were 2 species that were responding mainly to whether the habitat was mature. There were a number of species that focused on re-veg. Some species were more associated with high canopy cover. But what was interesting is that of all the species, the only one that avoided habitat edges was the long-billed thrasher. Other species would occur regardless of how far they were from the edge of the forest. So we didn't see big effects of distance from the edge like in some other geographic areas. The mature urban habitats, these are the mature residential neighborhoods, were in some ways the most distinct habitat that we studied, so I want to focus on it a little. So we had really high numbers of golden-fronted woodpeckers, you can see, very important because these are primary cavity nesters, and they provide cavities that will later be used by species like red-crowned parrots that you can see in the upper right. We also had green parakeets. Other more common urban birds are obviously going to be there, like northern mockingbird, great-tailed grackle, and house sparrow. But again, we were just interested and encouraged that some of our riparian birds, like brown-crested flycatcher, great kiskadee, titmouse, and kingbird, were also using these mature urban areas. Again, these are the best urban habitats, but it gives us a goal to shoot for to create that kind of, or encourage creation of that kind of habitat down the road. But one complicating factor I wanted to mention briefly was the flood that we had in 2010 after 6 years of drought due to heavy rainfall in the watershed, and it lasted for about 5 to 6 months in some areas. So it didn't change our overall results, but it might have blurred some of the differences, and it might have reset the vegetation back to an earlier stage. You can see this central yellow point is in a low former river channel. That area had most of the large trees that had developed actually die. So it was kind of undergoing succession by the time we got there in 2013 and 2014. And then adjacent areas that were just slightly higher up were not impacted. So it just added a little variability, but it didn't seem to certainly totally negate our overall patterns that we were seeing. So just to start winding up, basic conclusions are, as far as bird use of mature and revegetated habitats, bird species that prefer that mature thorn forest habitat with high canopy cover, good litter quality, little grass invasion, they did have lower frequencies in re-veg habitats. So we do need to preserve those mature thorn forest habitats in the short run while we're waiting for the re-veg to hopefully catch up as time goes along. But we did see overall that revegetated habitats did support many of the common breeders of the Lower Rio Grande Valley, very, very similar communities. So in that sense, we can consider revegetation successful for many bird species. And hopefully in the future, these re-veg tracts should more closely resemble mature habitats. But we'd like to get further data on habitat needs of some of the specialized species like the tyrannulet and the oriole to see what we can do to maximize their use of the re-veg areas. Our preliminary data on bird use of urban habitats in the valley was encouraging due to the high use by many riparian species. We found that patches of mature habitat, these urban woodlots within the urban matrix, are suitable for many mature forest species, and that well-vegetated residential habitats can also support unique species like red-crowned parrot and green parakeet. And again, we want to do a little further investigation there. So currently, as far as looking down the road and in the immediate future, we're expanding our study of urban habitats to include some of the newer neighborhoods. Many of these recent developments have very low canopy cover and low plant species diversity, but we want to see if there are features that will encourage bird use at a sooner time or in higher numbers. And also, more importantly, we want to continue our studies of birds in riparian habitats. To focus, now that we've done our initial survey, we want to look at analyzing habitat needs of some of these species of special conservation concern. like the common yellowthroat, which we have an endemic subspecies of. Some of the orioles, like the hooded oriole, you can see a nestling over here on the right that have declined a lot. Or the grayhawk, a neotropical raptor that seems to be expanding a little bit in the valley and making use of a lot of the re-veg. So we want to find out more of what habitat features and landscape features they're really keying in on and what we can do to encourage that kind of habitat to be created. And just to wind up, many thanks to the Gulf Coast Prairie Landscape Conservation Cooperative and Rio Grande Joint Venture for their strong support and interest. Many landowners, mostly Fish and Wildlife, Texas Parks and Wildlife, but some private groups allowed us to access. We have our data collectors and analyzers, and special thanks to Mary Gustafson of Rio Grande Joint Venture for her continued interest and assistance. You can see one of our field biologists, Edwin, here trying to get out of a thorn forest area, so it was pretty thick work at times. But with that, I'll be done. I'll be glad to answer any questions if there's time.
Great, thank you, Tim. I'm going to unmute all the lines, see if anyone has any questions.
The conference is now in talk mode.
Does anyone have any questions for Tim? You can shout them out now, or you can write them in the chat box if you prefer. Well, if nobody has any questions, the final report for this project is up on our website, gulfcoastprairielcc.org, under our projects page. This webinar was recorded and will be available on our webinars page on our website, as well as our YouTube channel. And I'll just give one more second if anybody's got any questions. Well, all right. Well, thank you, Tim, for your presentation. That was great. And thank you all for coming.
Okay, thanks a lot, Blair, for all your help.
Thanks, Tim.
Have a good day.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.